firewood is absolutely, no question, a major problem from the forest pest and pathogen perspective. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with firewood. It means that our modern ways of moving firewood really long distances in occasional situations, coupled with the increasing number of different forest pests and pathogens that are in our forests, both non-native pests that are invasive from other lands, as well as native pests that are now moving around more due to either climate change or human activities, it creates a combination problem. So I'm not here to say that in any way your firewood bank is bad, but I am here to say that there are things you can do to reduce the chance of accidentally moving forest pests as part of the operations of your firewood bank, so you can help protect the forests in the area in which you operate. So let's just talk about it. Let's be practical, and practical decisions are going to be what protects forest health. The Don't Move Firewood campaign itself, which is the URL down at the bottom of the page, we do a lot of public information all over the US and Canada to change the behaviors of travelers and campers that use firewood. You are not working primarily with travelers and campers in the situation of firewood banks, but I'm just showing you that we are everywhere. From these slides represent Utah, Montana, Michigan, 2 of them from Tennessee, lucky Tennessee, and 1 from California. And the guiding principles of Don't Move Firewood are where this becomes relevant. We are trying to protect trees. We are trying to do that by slowing the spread of invasive forest pests via firewood pathways. And we are targeting both firewood users and groups like yours. So partnering groups that educate. And as a firewood bank, you have the opportunity to either educate yourself if that's what's necessary, or educate the people who receive your firewood if that's what's important to you. And the messages are specific to the needs of firewood and the local conditions. So we do say don't move firewood, but I will give you some caveats on that in a minute. You should either buy it where you burn it, you should gather it on site, or you should use certified heat-treated firewood. So we have all these cool campaigns and posters and handouts and billboards and logos, you name it. All of these things are available to you for free if you'd like to reach out to us. But I want to make sure this is tailored to the needs of firewood banks. So you're working with people who need firewood for home and structure heat. And let's just start out with the map. The map has the rules, regulations, pest conditions, and recommendations for every state and every province everywhere. So if you go to don'tmovefirewood.org/map, and you're like, oh, wow, I really had just like no idea that, you know, Texas had this sort of an issue. You can just click on Texas and see, like, what are the concerns in Texas? What are the recommendations provided by the Texas Department of Agriculture? What are the rules if you're right next to a state line that you might want to know about in case you have firewood bank clients over the state lines, that sort of thing. So this map is an outstanding resource. And from here, a lot of questions might spring to mind from you. So, but I would love for everybody to start here because it's extremely approachable. Laurel and I work constantly year-round to make sure that this map is thorough, correct, readable, and useful to everybody. So if you want to take a moment, I won't judge, and head over to the map and look up your state, that's fine. But I'm going to take a pause because I don't want to dominate this conversation and see what questions you all have right off the bat where we're at right now. Are people able to just jump on, Darian? Is this?
Yeah, they can just unmute,
okay.
Hop on. We can also use a raise hand feature, really up to how organized or how many questions we get going. But yeah, just unmute yourselves and ask if you like.
And if people don't have questions, that's okay too. I just figured I'd make sure I didn't talk over people. We do have a good mix. So we got Arizona, New Mexico, Massachusetts, Wisconsin, more Massachusetts. Ooh, Utah, great. More Massachusetts. Love it. Thank you for adding the map link, Maddie. Awesome. Okay. If people don't have questions, I'll just keep going. But please jump in, interrupt me if that's helpful to you. So some, but not all, states have what's called an external quarantine of some sort. Some of those quarantines mean that you cannot bring any firewood into that state. If that's the case, it's a brick colored box. So for instance, Maine, you can't bring any out-of-state firewood into Maine, but Massachusetts does not have a regulation of that nature. Others have more complicated regulatory situations, like Connecticut's is kind of tricky. So that's kind of that butter yellow. Some out-of-state firewood is prohibited. And then the sort of pale yellow tan is that there's a forest pest and pathogen specific rule. Often those have to do with either the emerald ash borer or the spongy moth, which are two forest pests that commonly are associated with movement on contaminated firewood. Now, if you're getting all of your firewood from within the state in which you operate, and you are distributing all of your firewood in the state in which you operate, none of these external quarantine rules are going to be important for you to know about, aside from the fact that you should probably generally know they exist in case somebody calls you from another state and says, hey, can I donate all this firewood from Ohio into Pennsylvania? You would be like, well, not from Ohio. That would be in violation of Pennsylvania's state laws, but we really appreciate your kind offer, so you could help people avoid making those mistakes. And if your firewood bank is right on a state line, you might cross a state line every day. So you should definitely be aware if there are conditions due to where you are located, like an external quarantine. There are also very, very complicated rules, unfortunately, regarding internal quarantines in some states. So for instance, Massachusetts has an internal quarantine, which is basically you cannot move firewood out of it. Around Worcester, Massachusetts, which is in East Central Massachusetts, if you're familiar with Massachusetts, because of the presence of a particularly damaging forest pest, the Asian longhorn beetle. So if you're in Massachusetts, it's very much in your best interest to know where the quarantine region is around Worcester, Massachusetts, so that you don't violate a federal law when you move firewood. So we have those internal quarantines because unfortunately they are quite extremely specific to regions and states in a separate document called the Firewood Comparison Report. It's not one of these nice maps because they're just too complicated. Looking at the list of places, I'm going to go real fast. Our Massachusetts folks here need to know about the Asian longhorn beetle quarantine around Worcester. I'm moving quick. New York has a 50-mile limit unless it's certified. So if a New Yorker is operating a firewood bank, they really need to make sure that they understand what they can and cannot legally do. I don't see anybody in this call from New York, but Laurel, thank you for the reminder on that particular state law. There are lots of other state laws as well, and we have those all included in the Firewood Comparison Report. Firewood certification, I think, is actually really not honestly terribly relevant to firewood banks because the vast majority of your firewood is local and you are not selling it. So I'm just going to say that if you're also affiliated with a commercial business in any way, so for instance, if you are a nonprofit arm of a commercial business, then I would love to talk to you later about firewood certification, but I don't believe it's terribly relevant to this group. So we're just going to keep moving. Just so you know, much like external regulations, firewood certification is highly variable between different states. So you need to know your regional information. And then this was my list of questions that I just thought we could do a group chat about. What do you all want to know about forest pests? Are you concerned about moving spotted lanternflies? Have you figured out whether or not your area is infested with spongy moth? All of these forest pests are relevant to firewood banks, and you could accidentally, unfortunately, make those infestations bigger if you are not aware and using sort of best practices around firewood movement. So does anybody have questions right now?
Yeah, just jump in, unmute, and we can get it going.
And I didn't show you the firewood comparison report because it's a really long technical document that doesn't lend itself to a PowerPoint presentation. But I did include those graphs, which are off of the Firewood Comparison Report, and I will make sure that the Firewood Bank Summit follow-up material is included as a link, so it's available to everybody. It's also found on the Don't Move Firewood website.
I have a question, Lay.
Yes, please.
Moving logs, especially logs that have been long dead, standing, what is the difference between that and the firewood? And then this first one, or the second bullet point, how can your firewood be certified? Those are the two questions I would have.
Okay, well, let's start on logs. If there's two types of moving logs that's gonna be important here. One is moving logs because you are in some way an actual logging operation, in which case that's really different than moving logs as part of like a firewood bank situation. One is a commercial activity that probably requires extensive permits with the state. The other one is a more informal firewood collection, salvage, etc. Trees that are standing cannot have some kinds, so excuse me, trees that are standing up and dead for a long time. You know, if it's a pine tree, all the needles have fallen off. It's, you know, those trees are extremely less likely to carry wood-boring insects that are of concern. But it's really important to know that they are not necessarily less likely to have what we call contaminating or hitchhiking pests on them, because just by nature of being in the forest, anything, even if it was a rock, could have some of these contaminating and hitchhiking pests. So when you're moving dead trees for the purposes of taking them out of the forest to a firewood processing area, you know, some best practices would be to know whether or not you were moving in an area that has a forest pest of concern. So just look it up on that map I showed you. And then also respect any laws that might pertain, but you cannot consider a very dead, multiple years dead tree to be safe, because there are two different types of pests we're talking about here. Wood-boring insects, that's like emerald ash borer or Asian longhorn beetle. Mountain pine beetle can be moved long distances. That is a native pest, but it certainly can cause problems in when you move it around. But then there's the contaminating pests. So within, for instance, spotted lanternfly, spongy moth, those are the two biggies. So Clarice Hart says, yes. So if you work within one town and your firewood is being sourced within one town, the chance that you would run afoul of any of these rules and regulations, with the extremely rare exception of literally, I think, 4 towns in America, it's very close to zero. So if you have really tight-knit distribution and sourcing areas, forest pests and pathogens are not going to need to be one of your top concerns. If you have broader areas, if you're moving wood, you know, at least an hour away in the car, if you're crossing state or county lines, you ought to at least orient yourself to make sure that you're not making a mistake that has either legal or pest and pathogen ramifications, just to be a conscientious wood bank person. So yeah, and Clarice also puts in the chat that some larger wood banks have regional wood yards and distribution zones, which is a great strategy. I 100% agree. It's great on multiple levels. Number one, people associate locally with the action, so you're more likely to retain volunteers. Number two, you're going to save on gas. That's huge when you're talking about a volunteer opportunity. And number three, you're much less likely to run into any sort of forest pest and pathogen issue if you are keeping things local, both in terms of input of firewood and output to the firewood recipients. So in every dimension, having a localized operation is going to be better, including the forest pest dimension. Now, the other question that person had, I'm sorry, I can't see your name, certification. If you are a commercial operation, you can get heat treatment certification, or in very rare cases, I believe only in Minnesota, but honestly, might be Michigan, one of the Great Lakes states, you can get a local distribution certification. So for the purposes of a wood bank, you're not going to want to pursue heat treatment certification. It will be financially onerous and not necessary. But if you also, like I said, own a firewood operation, then that would be something that I would love to help refer you to the right people to learn more about. But that would be a separate issue.
Awesome. Are there any more questions? It looks like we have about 7 minutes left before I should herd everyone back to the main summit area. And then there's a break, so don't worry.
Yeah, if you want to, if you're like, I don't have any questions, but if you want to take this time to open up in a separate browser window, the don'tmovefirewood.org, and then just click on firewood map. It's the top link on that page. You'll find it. I'm happy to answer any questions about what you find on your state or province's page. I don't know if we have any Canadians today just jumping in. But we're happy to answer questions directly off about your state or any pests.
Haley,
What can I do for you, Laurel?
I just wanted to add something too real quick. As far as folks finding out what pests are an issue in their area, and even if you're not moving wood out of that area or breaking any sort of quarantine issues, it might be good to tell any recipients of that wood if there's a risk that the wood has a pest. So for instance, if it's an area that, has emerald ash borer, and I know a lot of trees from ash still come down and are great firewood. So it might be good just to tell the folks receiving that ash firewood, for instance, like, hey, there's a chance that the beetle could be inside this wood, use it for your home. That's great, but don't take it on a camping trip. Don't take it, anywhere else you're going. And so just for folks to have that information, I think would be valuable.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Laurel, is that folks that need firewood definitely also sometimes go camping or hunting, especially, and they might be tempted to bring some firewood with them because a lot of the time that seems like a really logical thing to do. But unfortunately, just as Laurel said, if you are in an area that has forest pests, that action could actually spread forest pests. So that's a really great point, that there is some crossover between the work that we do to educate the traveling and camping public, as well as the work that we would do with groups like Firewood Banks that are more about home heating firewood needs. So thank you for jumping in, Laurel. It's awesome. So Maddie adds in that, yeah, so Maine actually has some pretty strict firewood rules and regulations, which is a good thing because that helps protect Maine's natural trees and forests. So it's absolutely really important in Maine to think about how, especially with such a large border, you can avoid having, for instance, firewood donated in violation of state law by mistake, which you would not want if one of the firewood banks was near the New Hampshire border.
Okay, awesome. If we don't have any more questions, I'm going to go ahead and put the link for all Maine attendees in the chat, so you can slowly trickle back in. Of course, for the panelists, there is a separate link that I think y'all know about, so I'll let you figure that out.
Fingers crossed we can all get back in. Thank you very much, Darian. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, y'all.